if anybody else has questions, you can private chat them to either H. Foister or Ceiling Cat. We will give them right over and let Richard answer them for you. Okay.
So does so do you ever worry when you go on to these investigations, though, that I know you may not provoke, but there's always a possibility of attachment or somebody following you home because they didn't like what you said or did? Does that ever concern you? And what steps do you take other than the normal you can't follow me home stuff?
Well, I used to be, and this is a very arrogant thing, but I used to scoff at people that did so-called protection. And for 22 or 23 years of investigation, I never had a problem. So I built up this rather arrogant attitude that, oh, please, it's a waste of time. I don't have to worry. And then something did follow me home, and I ended up having to call a friend of mine, a fellow investigator who's also a Catholic priest. And I'm an agnostic. I used to say I was an atheist, but then my grandmother said, say agnostic because God's got lightning and Darwin's got nothing. And so it was kind of embarrassing to reach out to my friend who's a Catholic priest and say, hey, can you bless my house because something bad came back with me? And after that, I got my moment of hubris. I got humbled as I needed to be. And now I'm pretty, I should say religious, but very diligent about taking protection. So my friend, Father Stephen Widener, taught me how to do some light work. We will do this outside of a location. In fact, I was just at the Bel Air House in Ohio last weekend. We had some pretty intense activity there. And my fellow investigator, Wes Coleman, and I, Wes is with the Correctional Officers Paranormal Society out of Canada, and we were very forceful before we left the property of declaring that nothing was permitted to follow us home or attach to us, that it was going to remain there. And I visualized a circle of white protective light and things of that nature, which, touch wood, have worked so far since then.
Now we have a follow-up question that was, have you ever had, and we've had people on who say that they've had experiences of before they go to an investigation being visited by various spirits in their dream states. Have you ever had that happen?
I haven't, but Katrina Weidman, my friend Katrina, who does Paranormal Lockdown and now Portals to Hell on Travel, Katrina had a dream about the attic of the Bel Air House in the past. Before she went there, which was kind of interesting to me. And another of my colleagues, Sarah Stream, who works out of Iowa, she's primarily at Malvern Manor and places like that, had what seemed to be a precognitive dream about an old ghost town out in the middle of nowhere, which she's due to visit. And she recognized, after looking at some photographs, one of the building interiors from her dream. So although I've not experienced it myself, some people that I respect immensely have. And I definitely tend to think it's a thing.
Well, dreams tend to be a rehash of the day's events, so to speak. Do you go back and then dream of the investigations and how you would handle it differently? Or have you come to conclusions that you could say, oh, yeah, that's what I dreamt last night, and maybe that's the answer to what was going on there?
I generally don't, but again, I'm not particularly sensitive in that regard. I work with people that claim to be, and some do appear to be. I'm a big fan of not bringing my work home with me, especially after that one incident,
Yeah.
So one thing that Wes Coleman and I were discussing recently was I'm always a little wary anymore of sleeping at a haunted location, because in the past I've truly immersed myself there by moving into the location for up to a week or two. And you let your guard down when you go to sleep, don't you? In fact, at the R Theatre, the Gacy haunting, I have it on pretty good authority that Brad Kling's camera crew slept with the lights on when they were sleeping in the building, which sounds, it's easy to scoff at that kind of thing until it's midnight and you are in that place alone, right? But I think we're more open in that dream state. We're more open to what might be there, and we're also to a degree more vulnerable to something opportunistic that might try and come in. So I'm always leery anymore about sleeping at a haunted location. I did it at Asylum 49 when they opened the new wing. I was in the most active room, and I spent a couple of nights in that room alone. And it's not an experience I care to repeat.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Now, what's interesting, though, Henry, is I couldn't tell you how much of that is purely psychological. You know, the truth is that your mind plays tricks. And
I believe that.
Talking about hubris and arrogance again a little bit, when Cammie Anderson, one of the owners of the hospital and my co-author also, she called me and said, hey, the new wing is going to be available in February. You're going to be the first team to come in. Which room do you want? And I just said, well, the most haunted one, obviously. And so I made that decision sitting in the armchair I'm talking to you from now, noon, bright sunlight, drinking some tea, dog sitting at my feet, my most comfortable place in the world. And it's easy to say, oh, yeah, give me the most haunted room. Now, if this were the movie of my life, we would cut to me at 1 a.m. in this hospital bed in which who knows how many people have died in that room, thinking, why was I stupid enough to ask for this? You know what I mean?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Because every creak and groan, even as a seasoned investigator, your mind does play tricks, especially when you're alone. And you do have to guard against it.
Yes.
And the truth is that no matter what your age and no matter how mature you may or may not be, there's that part inside all of us that's still 5 years old and scared of the dark, especially when you've heard stories of tall black figures with red glowing eyes that have terrified patients and staff members in the room you're trying to sleep in.
Was you actually trying to sleep, or were you trying to stay awake and investigate?
So I would investigate until the wee small hours of the morning, and then would try and get some shut-eye because you can only go for so long. And I was sleeping with one eye open. I just could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. Now, again, how much of that is psychological? How much of that is biased because of the stories I'd heard about that room? What I would like to have done, and this would have been the smart play, would be to take someone who knows nothing about the history of the room, put them in there, and not tell them anything and see what they come up with.
Yeah, it wouldn't be me.
I also don't know that it would be entirely ethical. So,
Yeah. Well, you have to think about it, too, from the standpoint of while it was a working hospital, there were patients who were put in that room, and they may not have seen the darn thing.
Exactly. Absolutely true. So the mind, I think, plays tricks on us. And I really think that I would love to do an experiment someday where I take a control group of people and put half of them in a haunted part of a building and half of them in a part that isn't reputed to be haunted, and then see who experiences what without any kind of bias, without any information up front.
That's
a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. If you're an investigator and you're going to be in a place that's purportedly to be haunted, your mind is already looking for something that you can make out that, oh, did you hear that or whatever? And it might just be the house settling from the heat of the day or something. But yet every time you hear something, you start hollering, did you hear that? Like it's a spirit or something.
Yeah, definitely there is a bias that we all have toward that. I would love to take 5 random houses, one of which has a reputation for being haunted that I didn't know about. I would love to spend 5 nights in 5 different houses and see if I can pick out the haunted one. That would be more of a valid experiment, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, you often, and psychologically makes sense too. You're up all night. You're trying to talk to the spirits. You're trying to get their attention. And then when you try to fall asleep, of course, your mind is still trying to get their attention. You have no idea whether your mind is simply wish fulfillment or they're actually now paying attention.
Yeah, that's a very good point also. But you certainly open yourself up more when you do sleep. You drop those psychic shields or barriers that we all have to a greater or lesser degree. And also your defenses, I believe, are degraded the more fatigued you get. When you do it, just a 3-day investigation, even 72 hours, by the end of it, you're running on caffeine, and you've eaten. It's interesting. Paranormal investigators do not eat healthily on investigations. They're fueled by caffeine, junk food, and enthusiasm. And so I think that by that last day, you're so tired. You've eaten a whole bunch of stuff that's bad for you, and it all plays a role in degrading your normal psychic defense system, or call it what you will, which makes you, again, more open, which is a good and a bad thing.
Well, let's talk about shows I guess it's like Paranormal Lockdown, and a few that do actually try to sleep in the areas and by themselves in various locations. And, I'm trying to think if there's any real relevance to, other than entertainment, to an investigation to do that.
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for immersion. One of the benefits is, and Henry alluded to this just a few moments ago, every building has its own personality. And I don't mean anything metaphysical by that. It has the way in which it tends to cool down and contract at the end of a warm day, for example, and the various creaks and groans you get because of that. The way that air flows through a building, the way that construction behaves inside a building. It's important to understand all that. And I really began to study that because as a firefighter, I was always taught to study building construction because buildings are what get firefighters killed.
Yes.
It's a part of building construction that you can never know too much about that subject. So there is a great book I recommend to any would-be paranormal investigator. It's called Brannigan's Construction for the Fire Service. And it really is all about how buildings behave and the way they're put together. And it's one of those books you would not really think a paranormal investigator might find useful, but it's very useful, So once you're in a building for 24, 48, 72 hours, you start to realize that at about 8 p.m., that's when the building will begin to creak and pop, and that's perfectly normal. And that, in turn, should better prepare you for when events are happening that are not part of the building's usual routine, that seem atypical of the pattern.
Sure.
So familiarity is helpful sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Oh, very much so. Like what a solenoid valve sounds like in an air conditioning unit, and what dried out pipes smell like, which is sulfur.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it makes sense to have, and I think you do this from what I can tell from the descriptions you have of your team. Which is to have a wide range of people there with varying experiences and different backgrounds where you can see a lot of that.
I'm very fortunate in the company I keep. I have a lot of friends that are very, very skilled in diverse areas. For example, my friends Linda and Jason. Linda is an imaging technician in a hospital. Jason is a pharmacist. So Jason has a great knowledge of the way that medications behave, because so many medications have side effects like hallucinations,
Sure.
My friend Erin has a background in mental health, which again is very important when it comes down to dealing with witnesses. But I also have engineers that I work with, people that are engineers. My friend Catlin has a doctorate and she teaches religious studies, so she has comparative religions as part of her background. So I'm blessed with a diverse group of friends and colleagues. Wes, as I mentioned earlier, is a corrections officer, which, although it may not seem directly applicable, he's got a very interesting personality and skill set that he brings to the job as well. So I think having a diverse team of professionals is a huge, huge benefit to me. And I'm, whenever I write or whenever I'm working on a project, I'm very aware that I'm always standing on their shoulders.